We have the second webinar that's coming up on November 9th at 2 p.m. EST on collecting community needs assessment data. On November 13th, also at 2 p.m., we have analyzing community needs assessment data. And on November 20th, we have communicating the community needs assessment data. So we have again, this is an extended webinar series, and we're hoping you'll be able to join us throughout the series. And again, you can follow up with any questions in between or after, depending on how we can best support your work. So moving forward, let's do a quick review of the agenda that we have for this afternoon. We'll begin with a brief overview on the importance of the community needs assessment, and then we'll go to stage 1 of the assessment process, preparing the agency and defining the scope. Again, we'll cover making sure your agency is getting ready to do the needs assessment and some of the preliminary planning activities you want to engage in. And then Courtney will talk about stage 2 and stage 3, creating an assessment plan, looking at all of the potentially available data you have to complete your needs assessment, and then stage 3, deciding on which data you're actually going to collect. At that point, we'll transition later on in the series to the next webinar. So we'll basically pick up where we leave off to talk about, again, the data collection process itself, the analysis of data, and communicating the data. So this will be a deep dive series with each part of the needs assessment process dealt with in subsequent webinars. All right, so to start off, let's begin by briefly talking about the importance of the community needs assessment. Next slide. So what is a needs assessment? So again, a needs assessment is a systematic process for creating a profile of the needs and resources of a given community or target population. Of course, in community action, we do needs assessment as part of our overall approach to working with communities. Ideally, our agencies are driven by input from the community itself. We believe that communities can define their own needs, and that the community action agency is there to help work with communities to address the needs that folks have identified. And obviously, the needs assessment process itself is where that all begins. So it's crucially important to make sure that our needs assessments are done comprehensively and at the right stage of the planning process, because they really kick off all the other things that we do as community action agencies. So a common question is, how many needs assessments do we actually need to do? Agencies are often asked by funders to do multiple needs assessments. If you have a Head Start center, you'll have to do a assessment as part of that as well. But what we counsel is, if at all possible, you can use your comprehensive needs assessment as the one process to wrap up all those other processes. So ideally, you should be able to meet the requirements of needs assessment through doing just that one needs assessment process as required now by the organizational standards that's conducted every 3 years. So you, at least in theory, shouldn't have to do multiple needs assessments. Just that one assessment should be able to handle all the requirements that it takes when it comes to collecting data about the community. So it's also important to understand where the needs assessment falls in the overall community action planning cycle. There are 3 main planning processes that all community action agencies engage in. Obviously, the needs assessment kicks off the community action planning cycle, and then that moves into the strategic plan. And I think this is really important to emphasize that these are really an extension of the same process. When you frame your own thinking about community action planning, don't see the needs assessment and the strategic plan as 2 separate processes. They're really an extension of the community action planning cycle in its entirety. So the needs assessment is where you identify the needs of the community, and then the strategic plan is where your agency identifies the strategies that it's going to use to create the outcomes that you've identified to address those needs that you've gathered when you conduct your needs assessment. then all community action agencies are also required to submit a community action plan, and that's really the operational plan, the programs and services that you'll implement. Of course, each state does this slightly differently. There is no one overall template for the community action plan. Some states require them every year, some states it's every 2 years, but generally it's how you operationalize the strategies in your strategic plan as informed by your community needs assessment. Another tip I want to make sure everybody gets is that you should generally conduct your strategic plan within a year after conducting your needs assessment. It's very important for those two processes to be as tightly connected as possible. So hopefully you would be able to move directly from your needs assessment process into your strategic planning process, but make sure that they're connected as closely as possible. If you wait too long, you're potentially using old data, and also you might lose the thread of what you've learned in your community needs assessment. So try to make sure that those two processes are connected as tightly as possible. It's also important to emphasize that the needs assessment is a crucial part of the results-oriented management and accountability framework. When you do your needs assessment, you are doing ROMA. And as the graphic on the screen emphasizes, assessment is there at the top of the cycle. It's where the ROMA cycle starts, and that's why your needs assessment is so crucially important, because it really sets the stage and the foundation for everything you do after that, moving into your strategic plan, implementing your programs and services, evaluating the results, and making sure that you feed those results back into the planning process to engage in a cycle of continuous improvement. So the needs assessment process is really a crucially important part of the process because it informs so much of what we do as community action agencies. So some key goals of the needs assessment process, and these are some big picture things just to make sure that agencies are on the same page when it comes to why you're doing your needs assessment. So at the top, the needs assessment really deals with the needs and the assets within the whole community. One of the things we sometimes hear is that agencies focus on either the customers that they serve directly or the communities that they live in, but they're not looking at the entirety of their service area. So I think that's important to stress. Your needs assessment should really look at your service area as a whole, not just those places where you're providing services. And even though it's called a needs assessment, you should also be looking at the assets within the community because those can often help you in the design of your service delivery strategy. Next, it's important that your needs assessment go beyond simply describing the conditions of poverty in your community to really dig underneath and analyze the underlying causes of poverty that you've identified in your needs assessment. So we'll talk about this in more detail later on in the webinar series, but it's important that your needs assessment not just be an empirical document describing the level of unemployment in your community or access to housing, but that you also get into the analysis of why there might be outcomes that you're not satisfied with or what might be the underlying causes of certain trends that you see in your community. What you also want to do in your needs assessment is make sure that you identify the overall service needs of populations, gaps in services, and barriers to services. So you're not just focused on the folks that you're serving, although that is a critical source of information for your needs assessment. You also want to talk to your fellow service providers because they're sometimes the best sources of information when it comes to identifying where those gaps in services might be, where there might be challenges with the overall system of services in a community. So make sure that you're casting as wide a net as possible when you're engaging different stakeholders, and that'll be a theme we come back to throughout this webinar series. You also want to make sure if agency programs match community needs. Sometimes I think agencies do needs assessments, and then their overall mix of programs and services doesn't always change to reflect what those needs are. Now, it's understood that agencies can't address every single need in a community, and in some cases, you simply might not be able to add additional programs or otherwise address some needs that might be outside of your area of expertise. But it's crucially important that you use the needs assessment to take a look at where you're providing programs and services, to what populations, to what geographical areas, around what mix of needs, and then hopefully do what you can to address those mix of services, to address different populations whose needs might have changed in the intervening years. And that's, again, why that strategic planning process is so crucially important, because that's where you really decide how you're going to implement that overall mix of programs and services and strategies that you use to hopefully improve outcomes for communities with low income. It's also important, again, to support strategic planning and develop program priorities. The needs assessment helps tell you how much need there is in particular areas, and that's crucially important as you're making decisions on how to allocate resources overall in your agency. Needs assessments are also important because they can help you strengthen relationships with key partners and stakeholders. So you need to make sure that you're engaging diverse stakeholders, engaging different sectors from the very beginning of the needs assessment process, that you're reaching out both to your partners but to other sectors of the community that you might not engage with on as regular a basis from the very beginning of the process. That helps raise awareness of poverty-related issues. It helps raise awareness of your agency and community action, and it can also help you with the needs assessment process itself, both getting stakeholders to interview, but also potentially bringing in some additional resources if there are other folks whose interests might align in collecting the kind of data that our agencies collect as part of the needs assessment process. And then lastly, needs assessment really helps build community consensus around a policy agenda. And one of the things I really want to stress, and we'll deal with this in the last webinar, is make sure you're getting the word out on your needs assessment and its results. This is a real opportunity to reach out to the rest of the community, to make sure folks are aware of what's going on about the level of poverty in your community. But it's also crucially important to developing that community consensus around a policy agenda to respond to those causes and conditions of poverty. So don't keep your needs assessment and its results internal to your agency. Make sure you're getting the word out. And I think that starts at the very beginning of the process through making sure you're engaging diverse stakeholders from the very start. So I want to briefly touch on the organizational standards. We'll talk about other standards later on in the series. But again, just to make sure everybody is on the same page, Standard 3.1 says that you need to conduct a community assessment every 3 years and issue a report. So I think this is a relatively straightforward standard, but we want to make sure to stress that the assessment should be comprehensive and cover the whole community. And by issuing a report, even though you could probably comply with the standard by simply emailing it out to your key partners and folks in the community, or putting it up on your website, we really hope that agencies leverage all of the data that they collect in their needs assessment to communicate its key findings to the community. There's some additional resources on the partnership webpage. Courtney will also talk about the community commons site that the partnership supports. But that arrow up on your screen shows you where you can find additional resources on the needs assessment. It's in the Tools and Resources section of our website. So there's a drop-down menu that will take you to additional training and technical assistance resources. And one of the key ones is our technical assistance guides for the organizational standards. So what you see, if we could advance the slide. What you see up on your screen is our Technical Assistance Guide for Category 3, and that will help you make sure that you're in compliance with the organizational standards. Again, Courtney will talk about that Community Commons website, how to access that, but that's the other resource. Also, as follow-up to this particular series, we'll be developing a web page of additional resources to aggregate all that data that's out there and hopefully make a one-stop shop to make it a little bit easier for you to get support with your needs assessment process. So, for example, there are additional resources such as the NASCSP tool that you see up on your screen for conducting a comprehensive community needs assessment. We really think that this is one of the best guides out there as a how-to to help agencies do their needs assessment process. So we would encourage you, if you haven't taken a look at this guide, make sure that you take a look at it and use it to support your needs assessment process. And again, we will be aggregating this data as part of this series and get that web page up to hopefully make it a little bit easier for you to search all the information that's out there, all the supporting tools and other resources. So, on to the first stage of the needs assessment process. Again, we'll talk about the data collection process and itself and data analysis and communicating your needs assessment in later webinars, but I'm going to start with part one, stage one, making sure your agency is ready and defining the scope of the needs assessment. So we'll talk about choosing an agency team, identifying potential supporters, making sure you're engaging both your leadership and your board, and doing some preliminary planning in terms of defining the community. So one of the first steps that agencies should take in getting ready for a needs assessment process is putting the agency team together. Now, I know some agencies are larger. You might already have a planning department, so in that case, you're probably already fairly well organized, but especially for agencies that are maybe medium-sized or smaller size, making sure you've got that staff team together to support the process from the very beginning, I think is crucially important. Just handing doing the needs assessment off to one or maybe two staff members, while sometimes that may feel like that's all you can spare, I think the more you can bring additional staff in to help the process, the better off you'll be. This is also a good time to cast that wide net, look at other stakeholders, look at other potential sources of support, and really see who you can engage. And I think the role of the planning team, or whatever you call this particular body, a committee, a working group, it helps set the direction and provides oversight and feedback throughout the assessment process. Needs assessments are complex enough that you need to have somebody coordinating the process as a whole. This group also facilitates linkages with community leaders and other organizations. So again, by getting them together at the very beginning of the process, you can start that outreach. You can see if there are other organizations in your community that might be willing to chip in, might be willing to help with research or even with funding as part of the process. And certainly you want to start that stakeholder engagement process because you'll want to be doing key informant interviews, holding focus groups, doing surveys, again, not just with your customers, but with other community-based organizations, other service providers, public agencies, if you're not located within a public agency, and other sectors in the community, like the faith community, the business community, the education community. So starting that process as early as possible, I think, is crucially important. The committee is also, your team is deeply involved in the analysis of data. You want to have more than one eye when you ultimately get to the point where you're analyzing your data. You want to have folks who have different perspectives, maybe different program staff, folks with different backgrounds in different fields to take a look at that data, because it's complex enough that you don't want just one or two people to be writing that report. This team also provides long-term support for follow-up and implementation of recommendations, so you want to make sure that they're connected throughout the process. And they're also responsible for logistical operations like putting the budget together, helping schedule those interviews, and otherwise managing the process. So make sure you start this team at the very beginning. Another tip is you may have to adjust people's schedules or make other accommodations. The needs assessment process is in-depth enough that you might have to shift some responsibilities of folks together, so around, so it doesn't just become yet another thing that folks have to deal with in addition to all their other professional responsibilities. So make sure that the folks who are on the team have the time and the support to really dedicate themselves to the process. So who should be on the team? I think program managers, planning and development staff, board members, community partners, and also if you decide to have a consultant work with you on the process, I think it's really important to make sure that they have a clear point of contact and connection with the agency. So even if you outsource some of the data collection, some of the report writing, you want to make sure that there is still that team there to work with the consultant throughout the process to make sure that they have adequate guidance, they know what the agency needs out of the needs assessment process, and also they'll probably need support with connections with different stakeholders, with making sure, again, that the needs assessment meets the organizational standards and that it conforms to the requirements of a community action needs assessment. Another tip on the use of consultants is if you do use outside support to help you with your needs assessment, make sure they get brought in as early as possible so they have time to understand exactly what you need. Make sure they've read that NASCSP tool so they know what a community action needs assessment entails. There are other organizations or other networks that do needs assessments. So sometimes I hear about agencies getting very generic needs assessments that really don't meet their needs. So that team really becomes the consultant's primary point of contact and make sure that they stay on track. All right, another key task that the team is going to work on is identifying potential supporters. And again, if you're a larger agency, if you have adequate funding, adequate staffing, this is a little bit less of an issue, but I still think that all community action agencies should be reaching out to other sets of stakeholders in the community to see if they can support them with the needs assessment process. And I hear great stories when I go around to conferences and other meetings about how community action agencies have engaged with other partners in the community to support that needs assessment process. So public agencies, if you're not a public agency, often conduct similar processes. They do studies, sometimes full-blown needs assessments. So reaching out to other public agencies in your community is one source of support, and they may also have collected some of the data that you'll ultimately need. Other service providers sometimes are required by their funding sources to do needs assessments, so they're one place where you could potentially join forces, again, to share the research, share the effort, and sometimes maybe pool or blend the funding available to conduct a needs assessment. United Ways often conduct needs assessments, so they can be community partners. And again, because they conduct needs assessments regularly, they also have experience. So even if you don't engage in a joint needs assessment, they could also potentially be a source of technical assistance or at least collegial support as part of the process. Universities and community colleges often either do assessments themselves or they have faculty and students who are interested in these kinds of processes, so they can potentially be a source of support, help with data collection, and even participate in the needs assessment process itself. Community foundations often have an interest in the same type of data that our agencies collect, so they are another potential source of support, and they could also potentially be a source of funding support for the needs assessment as well. Hospital systems, especially nonprofit hospital systems, have to do community health assessments, and there's often significant overlap with that particular process. So at a minimum, just simply sharing data is a great source of support, but you may be able to engage them a little bit more deeply in the process. And finally, sometimes the private sector is interested in the data you collect, interested in your findings. So a local chamber of commerce, for example, may be interested in working with you on the needs assessment. And I think the bottom line is start out by asking yourself, who also has an interest in the type of data that we're going to collect and who might be interested in partnering with us at various levels. It may just simply be an interest in providing you with some data, making staff available to collect some interview data, all the way up to joint funding or conducting the needs assessment process with you. Of course, as always, if you do partner with other organizations, make sure that you're clearly laying out what your needs are as part of the needs assessment process to make sure that the final product really meets your interests as a community action agency. All right, so just to conclude, some tips for stage one. Again, make sure you're engaging those key stakeholders and sectors from the very start of the process. I think that helps both to find sources of support you may be able to leverage. It'll help you down the road with the data collection process. It also makes sure that you're getting the word out about the needs assessment as early as possible. So it really helps you more broadly engage the community. Of course, there's also an organizational standard that asks you to collect data from other sectors of the community, so it'll help make sure you're in compliance with that particular standard. And I just think it's good practice to make sure that you make the community needs assessment a community process, and you do that, I think, by reaching out as early and often as possible to those other stakeholders and other sectors. You also want to make sure that you involve your board in multiple ways from the very beginning of the process. The board plays an important role, I think, in the needs assessment process because they really are the ones who need the data that you collect and the analysis you conduct to then inform the strategic planning process. Community action boards give guidance to our agencies about their overall strategic direction, and so the needs assessment process really becomes, I think, the most crucial source of information to make sure the boards are aware of the needs of the community and really are providing good feedback and good guidance to our agencies, especially as you move into the strategic planning process. So some ways that you can do this are to create a planning committee. In some cases, you may already have a standing committee that you might be able to sort of fit into the needs assessment process. So don't reinvent the wheel if there isn't a need, but that's one way to make sure the board is engaged with the process from the beginning. Board members can also help you find those contacts and connections with other key stakeholders and sectors. So making sure that your board is helping you do that outreach work, I think, is one way to engage them, but also to make sure that you're really getting the most out of your board. Your board can also help you access resources to support the process. So, for example, if you have a board member who's from a local university or someone who's on a community foundation or from the local chamber of commerce, those are all valuable connections that might help broker some of those relationships to help you access some additional resources. And board members may be able to help you with the interview and research process. So you might have board members with a technical background on survey design or research or communication. So make sure that you're really using the skills of your board members to help you with that process overall. And then finally, make sure that you're defining your audiences and how the information will be used. And I think that's important to do from the very start of the process. You should be planning from the very beginning to get the results of the needs assessment out to as much of the community as possible, because this is really your opportunity to raise the profile of community action, help build that community awareness about the importance of your anti-poverty work, and build consensus on a policy agenda to address the needs of the community that you've identified. So with that, we're going to pause briefly. Courtney is going to take a couple of the questions that have come in, and then she's going to kick off the second part of the webinar talking about getting ready to do your data collection.
All right, well, we have had two questions that have come in. So the first one is, did I understand that we can use the Head Start Needs Assessment and that will satisfy Org Standard 3.1? And as far as the number of community needs assessments, kind of what we were talking about there is that it is good to make sure that you're doing an agency-wide community needs assessment. So the caveat there would be that your Head Start Needs Assessment would need to not be focused only on Head Start or needs for Head Start children or parents. So it would need to be a comprehensive needs assessment that you could use to meet both the requirements for Head Start as well as the Community Services Block Grant or other funding sources.
Right, and Courtney, just to emphasize that, I think it's more that your community needs assessment can help you satisfy the need for your Head Start needs assessment. So you're sort of doing both processes at the same time. You don't have to do a needs assessment and then do your Head Start assessment. You can combine them to make it more efficient and less duplicative. And also generally make sure you're integrating the Head Start component of your community action agency.
And then the other question is around the organizational standards, asking about the fact that the community needs assessment is required every 3 years. The strategic plan is required every 5 years. So with this, thinking that it may not align with the recommendation to do the strategic plan within 1 year of the assessment, and many agencies often default to the requirements.
And Courtney, what I always tell agencies with that issue is there is that difference between the 3 and the 5 year requirement. I would just go ahead and cross out 5 in strategic planning and just plan on doing a strategic plan every 3 years. I just think it aligns the 2 parts of the planning process. And again, you don't want to do your strategic plan too much after you've done your needs assessment. And so, you know, again, you can be in compliance with the organizational standards and you know, basically get away with only doing a strategic plan every 5 years. But I also think that the strategic plan is important enough that you don't want to wait 5 years before assessing, you know, the overall mix of strategies you're using to address the needs in your community. So I think if at all possible, you should really connect those 2 processes together. And anything else to chip in on that one, Courtney?
No, I agree with that. I think that it's just, you know, you do want to make sure they connect, so it really is best practice to do that strategic plan, you know, within 1 year following. Otherwise, your data in the needs assessment could end up being outdated. And so really just, you know, kind of overlooking almost that 5 year, it's best practice to do it maybe more often following the needs assessment. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions at this point, but as you all continue to have questions, please type those into the chat box, and you can send them to all panelists, and we'll address more questions after about another 30 minutes. Okay, so I'll go ahead and jump into the next part that we'll talk about. So as far as choosing your target community, you know, looking at, you know, you want to consider multiple levels, so zip codes, census tracts, different neighborhoods, city and county. So really want to have that discussion within your agency to make sure that you are clear on what communities you're looking at and that you're assessing. You don't want to necessarily exclude communities outside your service area, and you want to really use that boundary discussion that you have to identify key stakeholders also to engage. You also want to make sure to target stakeholders that are beyond your client population, and really create all your definitions out there. So define what it means to be in poverty. And then whenever you're looking at these definitions, you want to make sure that you're defining the community that you're going to assess prior to assessing it. You also want to make sure you define poverty. So what is it that you're looking at whenever you're talking about poverty? And I think Jarl usually explains this one a little bit better than I do. So Jarl, if you want to take this one, and then I'll follow up with the next slide.
Yeah, sure thing. And so I think sometimes there is a tendency to just use sort of the federal guideline on where the poverty line is. And while that's certainly the most commonly used definition of poverty, I would really encourage agencies to take a look at the supplemental poverty measure. There are also some networks and organizations that have some other ways to measure poverty. And I think the challenge here is that community action agencies know plenty of people that they serve who are technically above the poverty line in terms of how the federal government defines it, but are still definitely in poverty, that have crucial needs that aren't being met. And so I think to compare a couple of different measures is just a good way to make sure to show that there are different ways to measure poverty, and in fact, I think there is some credence to the fact that we might be undercounting the overall amount of need in our communities. So using some alternate measures, I think, is a good point of comparison, and just a reminder that there are different ways to make that determination. So what you see up on your screen is just a quick explanation of what that supplemental poverty measure is. You can just type that into Google, but it's also available through the Department of Labor. And as I mentioned, there are different organizations that have created different ways to measure poverty. So I think just doing a little bit of research and knowing that there's some alternatives out there is just good practice, and it's another way to hopefully more accurately represent the overall level of poverty in the community.
All right. Thank you, Gerald. Okay. So then whenever you're typing your definitions, you want to look at choosing your categories. And so on this slide here, you see some of the categories that are included in the Community Commons online tool. So this is some of the categories you can collect data within. There are probably about 39 to 40 indicators within these different categories in the Community Commons tool. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. And then you can also see here the domains of the CFPG Act. And so you can also see here that they align pretty closely, and that was done intentionally so that agencies are able to gather data easily through this online tool that kind of aggregates it from different sources, and really being able to relate to those domains of the CSPG Act, which is where you want to collect data in these different categories. So it doesn't have to you don't have to necessarily collect data in all of the categories. That might be somewhat cumbersome, but you really want to look at what community needs you have and kind of get an array of where the needs are at within these different categories, and then that can help you narrow down where you need more information based on where you're seeing these needs. So as far as what domains that you use, you want to consider these questions within your agency as you're planning for your community needs assessment. You want to see, what domains did you use in your last community needs assessment. You want to look at how you organized your domains, and then whether that created any challenges with the data collection. And then you also want to consider, whether there are any changes to how you organize your domains. And so having this thoughtful discussion beforehand can be important. And then, so the second piece of this cycle here is about creating an assessment plan. And within this piece of creating an assessment plan, you're going to develop your data collection planning matrix. Then also you're going to brainstorm the assets and the needs within the community and create kind of a wish list organized by type. So within this data collection planning matrix, this is something that's developed by the agency team or consultant. It really helps the team to brainstorm what potential types of data to collect, so that you're being strategic about the data that you're collecting, so that it's very helpful and useful to you in the planning process that follows. Then also it helps you to organize data around the 3 levels. So that's the individual family level, the community level, as well as the agency level. And so this is a very important point to make. Whenever you're collecting your data and you're realizing what your community needs are, really taking a look at them and defining whether it's a family level need, a community level need or an agency level need, because that piece of it is really going to determine what type of strategy that you're going to use and what type of outcomes you want to see. Also, whenever you're using this planning matrix, it helps to identify potential challenges with domains and data collection. So making sure you're collecting the right data within the right categories or domains, and then helps you to streamline the data collection process by prioritizing what type of data to collect. This can often be a very overwhelming process, so including this as you plan is very important so that you can do it as streamlined as possible as well as strategically. So some of these key questions that you want to ask as you plan out your data collection is, first of all, what individual or family needs will be assessed. And then you also want to look at what are the organization's needs that need to be assessed, and then what are the community-specific needs. So that's, again, honing in on those 3 levels within ROMA. Then also you want to look at what data and indicators are needed. If you really just don't even know where to start, you can start out by just looking at the indicators that are within the Community Commons site. I'll show you in a minute the front page of it. You can just explore the data just to see what's out there. And then you want to really ask the question of how will the data be gathered. And we'll definitely go into more of that in the next webinar, but we'll start to touch on different types of data collection today too. So as you developed your data collection planning matrix, first of all, you're looking at that level. So you can organize it like this chart that you see here on your screen. So you have the levels in one column. So you have the individual and family level, agency level, community level, and then you're looking at what data within that do we need to gather. Then you're looking at who has it, and then you're also looking at how is it collected. And when you're looking at different types of data, you also want to focus in on whether it's quantitative or qualitative. We'll talk a little bit more about those differences here in a moment too. So this is a sample after you start filling in the blanks. So you can see here this is focusing on the individual level. You're looking at what data do we need to collect. That's, an example here would be the data profile of the county residents. So looking at demographics of age, income, employment status, etc., which also meets part of the organizational standards because you want to make sure that you're collecting some of this demographic information. And then also looking at the income support program participation. So those are the types of data you might focus in on. And that's all quantitative. So if you notice, that would be numbers. Then down in the next column, or the next row rather, you have an example of the data you might want to collect is the perceived economic insecurity of general public, or the perceived economic insecurity of the community action agency customer. And so with those are qualitative types of data. So that's information, explorative information that you're gathering from participants to really get into the narratives that people are feeling about these different topics. Then you look at the next column, which focuses in on who or what has it. So where are you going to get this information? And with that first one, with the quantitative, this can be from census data. There's other databases online. Community Commons is one of them. You also might have state census data centers from land-grant universities, or a lot of times state governments have their own databases as well. And then also looking at your own agency database. So this is an important part to not forget about, is that you have your own data to look at. And so making sure that you're looking at that along with the census data. Then you see in that next row there where it looks at, the qualitative piece of that, the individuals or the organizational leadership, that's who has that qualitative information you're going to want around those topics, as well as public officials can have that as well. So they might be good to interview. Then you want to look at how is it collected. So looking at whether it is, good data, if it's valid and reliable, if it's clean data, and then how you're going to extract it from databases, and the method that you're going to use to get that. So whether you're going to use surveys, interviews, things like that. Of course, in the next webinar, we'll go much more into the different types of data collection and how to do those. So then the next piece is really around your data plan. And so you want to decide data is needed. You want to engage your board to define member roles, and you want to develop the message to community partners. So whenever you're planning out this piece, you want to make sure that you're engaging all the right stakeholders. So first of all, those primary people you want to seek out for the data, especially the qualitative information, are your customers. You want to gather information from them. Then you also want to gather information from your key partners. So that might be community organizations that you work with often, and so those are your key partners in the work that you do. Then you want to look at other community organizations out there that are maybe doing similar work as the agency. And then lastly, of course, you do want to survey the general public as well, just to see what those themes and perceptions are throughout the community. So then you want to also make sure you include multi-level data. So this is going to be really important, especially as you get to analysis. So everything that you do in this planning process really helps you to collect the right data as well as be able to analyze it. So this piece is something that you don't want to skim over. And so you want to make sure you're collecting your data from your target population that's determined during your planning process. And then you want to make sure that you collect it from your local community. Then you want to make sure you look at data in your region or state. So Community Commons is actually really great at being able to look at that type of data, look at what your state averages are, and then also the national averages, and see how all of those different levels of data compare with each other so that you can kind of get a sense of where your community is at in the big picture. So as you, in this data collection plan, you're going to be deciding what data is needed. We've already kind of talked about a lot of these, but there's different places to go and collect this type of data. So this would be in that column of, you know, what or who has it, as well as how are you going to collect it. So are you going to get it out of a database or reports from your agency system? Are you going to employ a survey to the community, to your own customers? Are you going to engage in some focus groups around certain topics? You know, have some more broad-based community forums to collect information, as well as conduct interviews with people. So here is, you know, whenever you organize this data planning matrix by domain, you can do that as well. So you have a section on housing, so what the different types of housing data that you want to collect. So you want to collect published statistics, then you want to determine what type of published statistics as well as who has it. You know, then you might have survey information around housing, a focus group around housing, and etc. Same with education, so that you can really drill down to the specific type of data that you want to collect, how you're going to go about doing it, who's going to be responsible, and that sort of thing. So another important piece of this is to really create your timeline and then assign responsibility. So not only, you know, where are you going to get the data, what type of data do you need, but around what time frame are we going to do this, and who are going to be the key people in the agency to create the survey, distribute the survey. As you all know, this is a lot of work, especially to do a community needs assessment that is very comprehensive and very, very good to go into the planning process. So you want to look at, of course, your budget to see what you're capable of doing, that staff capacity, and then you want to establish timelines. So we're going to have a couple examples here in a moment. You want to define the community action agency staff or the consultant roles. You want to recruit partners and participants to participate, and then you want to choose and finalize the data tools that you're going to use. So here are a couple examples of timelines that can be used. So you don't have to go out there and just guess, but you can actually use what some other states and agencies have used for their timelines. So this one came out of Missouri, and basically they took a process from March to July to collect all of their information as well as writing the report. So you can see the time frame on here for what the time frame they used for each piece of it, from surveys to the secondary needs assessment data, the statistics. You know, they also included, the other important piece to this, I think, is they also included the analysis and the prioritization and writing the community needs assessment. So they included the entire process on their timeline. Another example is out of Texas, actually, and they have a toolkit available as well that kind of walks through some of this. But they kind of charted it out in a different way, but put it out into different timeline and what activity would be done. So however you choose to create your timeline, but these are some examples. So a few other tips in data planning. You want to, if you can, use a 3-year time frame to allow for identification of trends. Also sequencing data collection to start with the quantitative methods first, so you can kind of see what the numbers are telling you, and then use the qualitative data to really explore what those numbers are saying. Also pairing data collection methods with types of stakeholders and data collection needs. So surveys for customers, informant interviews for partners. Then you also want to sequence quantitative and qualitative methods, so follow-up surveys with focus groups to really drill down to the data more. And then considering the connections to that strategic planning process. So always looking at how this needs assessment is going to connect to the planning later on. So just a brief overview of quantitative and qualitative data, because this is important to consider as you're planning for your data collection. Basically looking at what types of quantitative data you want to collect, what types of qualitative data you want to collect. Because as you know, this is another piece of the organizational standards, is to make sure that you have both in your community needs assessment. So quantitative data really kind of confirms. It looks at the numerical or statistical information, looks at demographics, economics, and the social indicators. And this is something that can be very time consuming. So one solution that the Community Action Network has developed is this comprehensive data tool. It's web-based. And so this kind of came out of Missouri. The Missouri Association partnered with the University of Missouri and created a web-based data tool. And now there's a few different states that have one, and the national partnership has one on a national level as well. So if you go to communitycommons.org, this is what will pull up. You have to go to Hubs once you get to communitycommons.org. It's free access. All you have to do is create an account. But I encourage you to go ahead and check this website out as you're learning about planning for your data. If you haven't seen it before, go in and learn about the data, see what indicators are in this site, play around, start a new assessment. All of the counties across the nation are loaded in here, so you can pull up that information from your service area. So you'll see here there's about 39 indicators within the Community Action Partnership Hub. So the data comes from the Census Bureau, American Community Survey, U.S. Department of Labor, and more. You can also see those data categories that we talked about earlier that are within the tool. So this is kind of a picture of the information that you can get out of Community Commons. You get charts, there's dials that compare the local area to your state area or the national average as well. And it spits out some good graphs and charts for you too. This is an example of the mapping room. So I encourage you to go in and kind of play around with the mapping tool as well to see what type of data you can layer on top of each other. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the analysis piece. But this will give you a sense of what type of data you can collect. Then there's the qualitative data, and this is really, whenever I mentioned earlier about sequencing the data that you collect, quantitative first, usually qualitative after that, because this qualitative data really looks at the narratives, the themes, and perceptions that are within the community. So it kind of helps explain the numbers. So this can help tell you what the at-risk or threatened resources are, what is available, what unmet community needs there are, as well as current barriers to accessing service. One piece that I always want to emphasize with qualitative data too, though, is that you want to make sure you're doing external qualitative data collection as well as internal. So you don't want to forget about your board members, and you don't want to forget about your staff. And you also don't want to forget about looking at agency capacity to be able to address the needs. But as far as external qualitative data collection, these are some different types that we'll go over in the next webinar. There are community forums, surveys, focus groups, as well as key informant interviews. Those are some different types of qualitative data collection. And a lot of times you want to sequence them in this type of order, starting with community forums and going to key informant interviews, so you can help drill down your data and dig deeper into those issues as you go through these different types. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you re-engage your board. after you have your data collection plan established. You might even hopefully have them involved in some of the planning process, but you want to help have them review the scope of the community needs assessment, let them review the data collection plan, look at the role that the board will play in the data collection plan and review. Of course, budget approval is important as well. And then have the board be engaged in some of the outreach to key stakeholders and partners, outreach to the media, so that you can really get those people involved that need to be involved, and then communicate the needs assessment afterwards. So again, next time we'll be going into the collecting of the community needs assessment data, so it'll be more of a how to collect the data. Today we just more talked about the planning of collecting the data, and then we'll talk about analyzing needs assessment data on the 13th and then communicating it on the 20th. So I think at this point we'll go ahead and pause for questions.
Sure, and so Courtney, a number of questions have come in. First, there was a follow-up to the question about sequencing the strategic plan and the needs assessment, and a suggestion that maybe it would make sense to have them every 4 years if your state was on a 2-year community action plan cycle. Again, I think the most important thing is connecting the strategic plan to the needs assessment, and since the organizational standards do require you to conduct a needs assessment every 3 years, I think by default, that sets the planning cycle. And so even though you could be in compliance with the standards and only do a strategic plan every 5 years, I just really think it's good practice to make sure those two are connected. And the other thing is, I think you're really pressing if you're trying to look so far in the future. If you're trying to look 5 years out with your strategic plan, I think that's probably pushing it by a little bit. So doing a strategic plan every 3 years, really make sure that you're keeping it up to date. Things change in communities. That's why we do new needs assessments every 3 years. But the same thing is true with our strategic plans. And of course, the community action plans, some states require those every 1 year, others every 2 years. But again, those are really operational plans. Every state does it a little bit differently, but you're typically reporting on what kinds of programs and services that you're providing, how many people that you hope to serve, how many people did you serve the last time around. So even though, that is a critical part of the planning process, I really think the needs assessment and strategic plan, from a big picture perspective, are the two most important processes to make sure that you're connecting. We also had another question: is there a tool that provides the planning matrix that Courtney talked about? That's found in that NASCSP guide we showed you at the beginning of the webinar. You can get that from NASCSP's website, or just type the title of the guide into Google. It's available, again, free in a PDF form. So if you have any trouble finding that, just shoot Courtney or I an email, and we can connect you with that guide. Another question asked: when developing the needs assessment surveys, should we only determine the needs that can be classified as an NPI need? And I think when you're doing your data collection, you really want to cast as broad a net as possible, and then you can compare the data that you collected to the NPIs. Don't let the NPIs necessarily drive how you're doing the data collection. You want to look at how the data you do collect relates to those NPIs, but don't put the cart before the horse there. Another question came in that asked: are you saying that data collection should be organized by levels of family, agency, and community? And again, I certainly think that's one way to look at it, but primarily what you're looking at is those domains that Courtney talked about. So most community action agencies organize their needs assessment, according to domains like education, housing, workforce development. And I think those domains are the primary drivers of how you're collecting your data. What you should be doing is, within those domains, looking at family needs, looking at agency needs, and looking at community needs. So that provides you with one way to help sort and organize your data. And we'll get into that more over the next couple of webinars. We also have a question that's come in. Will the slides be available after the webinar is completed? Yes, we always post our webinars along with the slide decks on the Partnerships webpage under that Tools and Resources drop-down menu that I showed you, or you can just shoot an email directly to Courtney or myself, and we'll get you those slides out a little bit more quickly. We had another question. David Bradley is putting on a webinar on the 9th at 2:30. Are there any chance you can adjust the time of yours? And again, it's always a challenge in community action with so much going on. Typically, our webinar schedules are set just based on some internal scheduling issues. But again, the webinar will be recorded, so you can access that at your convenience. We always post the webinars we do on our webpage, and of course, you can follow up with Courtney and myself directly. We're always happy to talk with you offline and in more detail about what we've discussed in this webinar or additional technical assistance needs. So look for the webinar and the webinar slides up on our webpage, or just simply shoot Courtney and I an email. And again, we're more than happy to follow up with you on any of the questions that we've discussed offline. So shoot us an email or give us a call. We're always happy to talk with you in more depth. So again, thank you for coming out to this afternoon's webinar. We still have 3 more to go. We also have some resources at the end, so some additional places you can go to find additional support for your community needs assessment. And if you have any resources that you think would be valuable to other agencies, please send them to Courtney and I, and we will organize them as we put up the web page that I talked about at the beginning, where we'll try to organize and curate some of the resources that are out there to make it a little bit easier for all of you to find. So again, thank you very much for attending. Hope to see you on the next webinar. Again, these are our emails, so you can reach us directly if you have any questions or suggestions for resources to include. So thank you all very much. Have a great week, and looking forward to seeing you the next time. Courtney?
All right. Thank you, Gerald. And we'll go ahead and conclude the webinar. So we'll hopefully see you next Thursday. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.